I'm joined by the writer and director of Benediction, Terence Davies, and its star, Jack Lowden. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Terence, I want to start with you. When did you first discover the poetry of Siegfried Sassoon, and what was it about him and his work that drew you to making Benediction?
Well, it's sort of rather circuitous. When I got into drama school, you'd have to do a piece of Shakespeare and a piece of your own choice. And somebody had introduced me to Concert Interpretation, which is one of his few comedy poems, but it is wonderful English. And I did that for my own piece and got into drama school. I had never really read him like I had Rupert Brooke or Wilfred Owen. And then about 6 years ago, it was actually at Toronto, Ben Roberts said, "Have you ever thought of doing something about Siegfried Sassoon?" I said, "Well, I know nothing about him." And that's when I started to really look into his life. I mean, these three vast biographies, he was never in. He knew everybody in the world. He was never in, as opposed to Emily Dickenson, who didn't go anywhere. But that's where it sort of comes from.
Mm-hmm. And it was Ben Roberts, that current head of the British Film Institute, who was the one who suggested this idea?
Yes.
Oh, amazing. How much of your own evolution as an artist do you see in Sassoon's life and work? Are there any parallels as you were making the film that you discovered?
Yes, and the main thing that I had to cut the areas in which the film looked down to a way that was interesting, and so that he was a poet, obviously a great poet. He was gay. He got married, which I didn't, and a lot of gay men then did, and then he converted to Catholicism, which is extraordinary. So, as I speak as a ex-Catholic, but what I think he was looking for all the way through his life is redemption, and he never finds it. I mean, you can't find redemption in anybody else or any other thing. If it's not within you, then it's not there. And I think I share that with him, a devoted Catholic. After constantly praying to be forgiven, and no succor came, I know what that feels like. But I think he's also an outsider, and I've always been an outsider. I didn't know that when I was a child. I just listened all the time. But I'm an observer of life. I'm not a participant. And when you're not a participant, you get ignored.
It's a good position from which to be an artist, though, as an observer.
Yes, but as a person too. I mean, I didn't know that when I was a child. But I mean, I was the youngest of 10. I mean, 7 surviving, and they talked all the time, and I just listened to them. And you don't know that you're just being an observer as a child. You just absorb the world. But that's why I think I'm attracted to people who are not so much anti-heroes, but are flawed, because I know what that feels like.
Yeah. Jack, you're playing the young Siegfried, a man who is flawed, traumatized also, and made very vulnerable by his experience of the First World War, but also by the expression of his sexuality at a time when it was very dangerous to be a gay man. I wonder how you put together both the external physical performance of someone who's been through war and is somewhat shattered by it, but also the internal elements of Siegfried to play him.
I mean, it's guesswork. I think some artists try and find a far more sort of romantic answer to that, but it's guesswork for me, which is why I do what I do, is that I enjoy pretending to be things that I'm not, pretending to be in situations that I'm not. It sounds like a fairly simple point, but that's acting to me. That's acting at its true sense, is to be 1 minute stood over there with an ice cream, and then the next minute you're in a foxhole. That's the great privilege that you get as an actor, is that you don't have to suffer any of the consequences of the people that you play. It's not real, and that's the challenge, is to make it real, make it feel real, but make it look real. So it's I don't dwell on it too much. I just if I've never been to war, I don't dwell on that. I try to use anything in my life that I can draw on, but there's nothing in my life anywhere near close to being in the trenches in the First World War. So I pretend, and I enjoy pretending, and it's fun. It's fun. Yeah.
refreshing attitude towards acting. You're not clearly not a method actor then.
Not in the slightest. Not in any way, shape, or form. I've been fortunate enough to play, many different roles, and I've been on stage, and I've been in an Ibsen where I've had to have a syphilitic stroke every night. And I think if I was to push myself to try and feel what that is like and experience what that's like eight times a week, I think I wouldn't make it out at the end of every week. And I think I admire people that are. I truly admire actors that are as method or whatever it's called, but I admire the opposite as well. And I enjoy the magical line. I enjoy crossing the magical line. I enjoy being one side, being me, and I enjoy that in 3 seconds time being someone else. That's where I get the kicks, really.
Terence, you have both the younger and the older Siegfried Sassoon as a part of Benediction. Jack playing the younger and Peter Capaldi playing the older Sassoon. Why was it important to you to show us his life at those two different stages?
Because I think, I had to show what his life had become after he got married. And he did not treat his wife well, and he didn't get on with his son. And how do you carry on after having been through the psalm? I mean, how do you do it? He always fell for the wrong men, except Wilfred Owen. That is pure love, and it's never consummated. But it needed the anchor of this is what he became, and he became not a particularly nice man. But we have to take into account that all that started in the trenches and watching people blown to pieces. That's where it begins, and it was important to have a kind of architectural counterbalance to that, to say this is how he is, and this is why he's been affected like that. Hence the non-linear narrative, because you can move in and out of time very quickly in film. That's what's one of the joys about it. You can be in the narrative present, and then you can be in the narrative future. That's what's wonderful about it. But it was important to see him at the end of his life. It was, for me anyway.
Terence, you've made a number of films that are set in the first part of the 20th century, and Jack, whether it's by choice or by accident, you've made a number of period films, Dunkirk for Christopher Nolan, and Mary Queen of Scots, and the TV series War and Peace, and now Benediction. Is there anything about accessing a different time, in that particular time, I guess the first half of the 20th century, that requires a certain amount of attention or certain details to pay attention to? Because I imagine that just simple things about behavior, how a young man behaved in the 1920s is different than in the 2020s. And I wonder how you access the specificity of that period in this film.
Well, it's interesting, and I think I'm a history buff. I'm a history nut. I think if I didn't do this, that's what I would do. I would just sit in a room and read books on history and just visit every single castle in Scotland that I could. It's interesting as an actor, I think, particularly when you play period. And yes, I've played a lot of period, and I've never sort of specifically gone after it. I guess I just have one of those faces, so I get given them. But I'm glad for it, because the research is almost as fun as the playing. But I when I was younger, I used to think, how did someone sit in the 1920s, or how did someone sit in the 1540s? And I think there is time for that. But I think if you become, as an actor, too obsessed with that, you really lose the fact that you're basically playing a human being. And I truly believe that the nature of human beings hasn't changed all that much, over the hundreds and hundreds of years of our history. So, whether in the 1500s it meant that everybody sat or everybody stood like Henry VIII, people in the 1500s definitely slouched against walls in private moments. And I think just because you play a king or just because you play a prince, it doesn't mean you have to tie your tie like a prince. You just tie your tie and someone comes in and calls you prince. I think if you've got to play a human being first, but it's an enormous amount of fun. Whenever I get given a chance like this to delve into someone like Sassoon, I'd pay to do it, to be honest.
And Terence?
Well, there are two answers really. One, the reason I do periods because I don't know anything about modern life, and I'm actually afraid of it because I don't know any of this technology at all. I can't do it, and I'm afraid of it. Also, what I don't like that's come out of all this technology is the level of narcissism, which I think is really repulsive now. On holiday and take 840 selfies while they're in Mallorca. I mean, why? Why not stay home and do that in Croydon? It's just as dull. But what's also important is the tone of a piece. You have to understand that when people were in the 30s and 40s of a particular particular class in this country, they spoke in a specific way, and you have to get the speech right, because if you don't, the thing that is awful about a lot of period stuff is they speak in modern language. Well, you cannot have someone in a period drama, say of 1815, saying "good to go." Well, because they didn't say that in 1815. They just didn't. So you've got to get the tone right as well as the look. But I've got nothing to say about modern life, except that I'm frightened of it. I don't understand it.
Hmm. There's a line in a poem by Sassoon, Absolution, where it says, "War is our scourge, yet war has made us wise." I also noticed that the wars of the 20th century, the great wars, First and Second World War, are also very central to a lot of your filmmaking, and certainly in Benediction, the First World War. How have those two great wars of the 20th century shaped your perspective as a person and as a filmmaker?
I think they're an enormous effect, and I think it's an enormous effect that's still being felt by everybody. I mean, although many more people were killed in the Second World War, the casualty lists from the First World War of the great battles are still shocking. Every single part of Britain was affected by someone lost somebody. Except there are 13 villages, and they're called thankful villages, because in those 13 villages, nobody was killed in the First World War. It's an enormous effect on the whole of the world, I think, not just Britain, but on the whole of the world. And that one of the things that I was determined about, because we didn't have the money, was to show the cliche of this long Edwardian summer where everyone floated around looking beautiful. Great if you were in the upper class. If you're working in a factory, it wasn't that beautiful at all. And we couldn't afford recreations of the trenches. And when you see that footage, even if you had billions and billions of dollars, you cannot recreate what it was like. And I was determined that the footage spoke on its own. So I made the interiors look lush. You get around it that way because, I mean, the thought of people floating around in tulle, saying, "Isn't it wonderful?" as they row up the Thames the wrong way. I mean, it's just not interesting.
I want to ask you more about the production of the film. You said it was done on a modest budget, but you also shot this during the pandemic, as I understand it. And I wonder what that was like as well, because obviously there are the dangers of COVID, but there are also the limitations it places on how you can shoot. How did the production change for both of you than the pre-COVID shoots that you've done?
Well, we had to be tested every day, once a week, and then temperatures, which meant that it added, I think, something like £35,000 to the budget. And that was found by the BFI and the BBC, which was enormously generous, because a lot of smaller films went under because they couldn't afford that extra cost. We didn't have a single case of COVID. It was just a joy from beginning to end. And it's the very, very first film that I can say, even if everybody hates it, I can say, actually, you're wrong, it's good. It was a wonderful experience. The level of commitment from the actors, from the crew, from everyone, all the way through, has been so extraordinary that actually it's not my film, it's ours.
Oh, it's lovely. And Jack?
Yeah, I actually remember I was talking about this the other day. We were actually scheduled to shoot. We it was around March of that year, wasn't it, Terence? It was
Mm.
far earlier. And I remember I think we were about three days from turning over.
Yes.
And we were down in Pinewood. Yeah, down in Pinewood doing screen tests about the look of Sassoon and other characters. And we were watching the news coming in. And I remember Terence coming forward and saying, and because that was the strange thing about doing it during this, is that it felt, even though it's an important film to make, every film should be if you want to make it, but it began to feel at that point silly. It felt sort of silly, and you couldn't get into anything. You couldn't care about whether the shirt collar was right or not, or whether the hair should be darker, because we were literally watching the news rolling in about this, and it was Terence that stepped forward and said that, I'm really sorry, but I don't think we should continue with it today. And then the very next day, I think practically the lockdown began to happen. Mm-hmm. So it was bizarre. And so then, yes, to get it back off its feet in, I don't know what that was, 4 or 5 months. And then we were shooting up in Wolverhampton. And there we did. We had not one case. And compared to these multi-million-pound films that are happening right now, that are constantly being shut down, we had not one case. We were well looked after, and Terence is right. The crew, everybody were just extraordinary.
You're right.
I want to ask you, Terence, about making a film about Sassoon. As you said, he was a gay poet. You're a gay filmmaker, as you said, and from my understanding, anyhow, this is the first time that you have directly addressed what that experience is like for LGBTQ artists in particular in your films, with an unambiguously gay character. And I think that'll mean a lot for your audience, your viewers over the years. But what does it mean for you to make this story now?
Well, I just responded to all those things that I told you about. His sexuality was just another aspect of him. I was asked this at film school, what's your audience? I said, well, I have no idea. I don't know why audience watch things, and it's when you actually have to sit and watch the film in a festival, and they laugh in the wrong place. You think, oh God, it's just awful. And every cut, you think, oh God, why didn't I come out of this shot like days ago? So I have no idea what the audience is, and no one can know until after they've seen it, and then it's too late. It's after the fact. It's so I honestly don't know. I honestly can't answer it fully, except in that vague way.
Mm-hmm. I think you're torturing yourself far too much. You have a large and devoted audience. I'm sure you must know that. Certainly at our festival and when we show your works at the Cinematheque, there's always an avid group of moviegoers who wants to see your films. I mean, they have such deep emotion, such strong understanding of human relations, and there's a kind of an ethic in your filmmaking as well that I think a lot of people appreciate.
But also you've got to understand that there's a thing on television called Talking Pictures, which shows a lot of films, particularly British films of the 40s and 50s, and you realize just how moribund it was. I mean, it was lifeless. Everybody talks in this. Everybody talks like that, and if you're a lower member of the audience, then if low caste, then you do the sort of the funny bits, I mean, so much so that they should have a disclaimer in front of all those films, which is the following film contains acting that some viewers may find very distressing.
Jack, I'm getting the sense that Terence might have been hilarious on set. What was it like to work with him?
It was we were recently talking about the scene where I got to Charleston, which is, for one thing, I will be forever in Terence's debt. One of the many things I'll be forever in Terence's debt is learning how to Charleston. And sort of there was a period of about a week before we shot that scene where at any moment I was just stood whacking my legs out. And it was, and the hotel, because we all stayed in the same hotel, but none of us had. It was during COVID, nobody could hang out, nothing. But I sort of wore the certain patch of the carpet out in this hotel for a week by just shuffling my feet back and forth to Charleston. But no, it was wonderful. The wonderful thing for me for shooting with Terence was how much, whether Terence says or not, how much for me to watch Terence, his relationship with the character of Sassoon, and watch how much I think, I could be completely wrong, but how much I think Terence saw in himself in Sassoon, not necessarily Sassoon, but the things that he encountered and the emotions that he dealt with. Like Terence said at the beginning of this, it was very moving to watch on set, to watch someone that involved in a character was sort of wonderful and very personal. And I remember when we would do scenes with me or Ivor Novello, who was a horrible, and certainly written in a very horrible fashion, in the script. And Terence would say things like, "He's horrible, he's horrible. Watch out for him. Watch out for, we don't like him." And it was almost as if Terence was saying "we," and I thought of, it really was wonderful to take myself out of the equation sometimes, and simply live through the character, through Terence into the character. It was really wonderful.
But what is also wonderful is when the actors do something that you hadn't thought of. I mean, that's wonderful. In the scenes with Dr. Rivers, the line is, "I don't know why I come here. It hasn't done anything," and Jack's voice just broke halfway through. I mean, it just pierces your heart. It just pierces your heart. And I love it when people do that. I mean, I'd heard Disabled as perhaps even angry at the end, but he played it completely pianissimo, as if it were a farewell to life. How dark and late it is. Why don't they come and put him into bed? Why don't they come? That was just so heartbreaking. And that's when they do something different. I love that.
Yeah.
It's such a pleasure to hear the two of you speak about the film, and it's clear just, the strength of the relationship as you were making it. I want to thank you for this conversation, but also for making Benediction and bringing it to the Toronto Film Festival. Thank you both.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, Jack.